What makes user stories good? How do you know if you wrote a good user story? As you've noticed by now, the world of Agile and XP and everything else is littered with acronyms. And sometimes they make it easier to remember stuff, sometimes they don't. I think this is one of the ones that actually makes it easier. A smart user story is a good user story. So what are the S, M, A, R, and T in smart? And we'll go through each one. But the story should be specific. It should be measurable. It should be achievable. And that one varies. But we're going to say if you can finish it within one iteration, that's achievable. Relevant, and we'll talk about what that means. In other words, why is it relevant to the customer's business? Why does it have business value? And time-boxed, which means sometimes you got to know when to give up. The story is taking longer than you thought, and it's time to back off and find out why is it taking longer than we thought. So let's go through each one of these at a time. Again, most of these are not rocket science, but if you've never had to think about it this way before, it takes a little bit to sort of get your brain into this mode. Specific and measurable. By the way, if something is neither specific nor, or if something is not both specific and measurable, it's really hard to test it. So I'm just going to start with that. Remember that for us, one of the goals is, can we use the stories not only to describe what is to be built, but eventually to actually test by running the app that it actually functions as we expected. So this means that we have to be specific about inputs and conditions to the stories and what the expected result is. That's why, this is a sort of stupid anti-example, but the UI should be user-friendly. Well, first of all, if you have a way to measure that, then you need to rewrite the story in terms of that measurement. For example, it takes a new user, X number of seconds or X number of clicks to figure out how to do a common task. And if it's not measurable, then you're kind of sunk because you won't have any way to test if you achieve the goal or not. A little more sort of specific than that is, OK, well, suppose we break down the user story and we specify some initial conditions, a thing that is some action that's going to be taken, probably by the stakeholder, and some expected post conditions, one or more specific things that should happen as a result. That's a way of getting it a little bit more specific and measurable than just something like this anti-example. So what would be an example of something like this? Well, suppose we say, OK, I'm going to make it more specific. Let's say my Rotten Potato site also sells movie tickets. A user story might be, given tickets to some movie are available, I, as a customer, should be able to buy a ticket. OK, well, that's better because it describes a very specific action. But it's hard to tell what the main focus of the story is. Is the idea that we're trying to make sure, like from the box office point of view, that the correct computation of tickets being available is done? Is that the point? So that if you're looking at a movie that is sold out, you don't see the opportunity to buy? Or is it that the story is really about the patron has an account, and like if I buy tickets, then the next time I log in, I should see in my account that I have those tickets? Or is it just about the flow? Like, what are the specific steps that the patron should take in buying a ticket, and what should happen at each of those steps? So it's hard to tell any of those things just from this formulation. What we'll see is that we start from a story like this. This is the kind of thing you would come up with your customer, and you can refine it somewhat. But eventually, you're going to get to a level where you start spinning out scenarios based on the story, and that's where you really get specific. So a scenario that might come out of this story is something like the following. It might say, given that the movie Roma is playing at my theater, and there are 20 tickets available, and I'm logged in as a patron, then if I pick 2 tickets from the drop-down menu and enter my credit card, then my account should show that I have 2 tickets. Something like that, right? So now it's specific enough because I've identified a particular set of preconditions. There's a particular movie with this particular number of tickets available. I've specified specific actions that the stakeholder would take, right? I go to the site, I pick a number of tickets, I enter credit card information, and I specified the expected post condition. After I'm done with all that, then when I go back to my account page, I should see that I have 2 tickets for that movie on that date at that time. That you can write a test about, right? You could even imagine handing a human being who's like your unpaid summer intern saying, OK, here's a script. You're going to buy 2 tickets for this movie. Go. And you can imagine having the human being sort of step through the site, do all of the actions, and at the end, they're like, yep, the site works, or oh, no, there's a bug because when I entered invalid credit card information, it let me buy the tickets anyway. And by the way, that's how a lot of sort of QA testing for websites used to be done. That is old school. You're not going to do that. We're going to automate all that stuff that I just said. And it's delightful because then when you watch these tests running, it is like experiencing a bunch of little mechanical users interacting with your site and verifying that your code is good. It is a wonderful, wonderful feeling. So there's a limit to how specific you can get with the customer in the initial meeting, but when you write the scenarios, those are going to be specific enough that they literally are turned into runnable tests. Super cool. Achievable. Let's go on to the A in SMART. Ideally, you can finish the story in one iteration. And as we'll see, there are ways that you can break up stories into pieces so that if you have to deliver a subset of stories, you can complete the entire feature later. For example, in the version that I just gave, it might turn out that all of that work is more than you can finish in one iteration. So you might say, OK, I'm going to break it up into 2 stories. Story number 1 is about the customer goes to the site, there's a particular movie with tickets, they choose, and there's a shopping cart. And by the end of the story, the goal is they see the tickets in their shopping cart, but they haven't paid yet. Then story number 2 is, given that I have a shopping cart with 2 tickets in it, however they got there, then I enter my credit card information, I pay, and then when I look at my account page, the tickets are there. So you basically find intermediate points where you can divide it into precondition, action, postcondition, end of story. New story, precondition, which is based on what should have happened before, but now you can set it up any way you want, right? So for that second story, the one that begins with, assuming I have 2 tickets in my shopping cart and I haven't paid for them yet, in that scenario, it doesn't matter how the tickets got there. In fact, you could imagine 2 different people on your team working on those 2 stories in parallel, because the second story only says somehow the tickets got in the cart. The code that would have been required to let the customer do that is not technically needed. We can force the tickets into the cart some other way just so that the story's preconditions are met. So one of the challenging things about working with stories is exactly this. It's subdividing them so that something that is too complex for one pair or one developer to do within the iteration can be broken up into nice sub-pieces, and any given sub-piece can probably be finished. Yes, question?
Okay, yeah. So you said in the whole point of, or part of the purpose of developing stories is it's something you can complete in one iteration, because
Ideally.
The customer probably wants it. So what if you have a story that the customer deems to be really important and it can't actually be one story, you have to break it up?
Yeah, so the question was, if the whole goal is to prioritize, understand what the customer wants and prioritize the important things, what if the customer's most important high priority story is complex enough that you have to break it up and you won't finish all the pieces in one iteration? That is called, your team has a limited amount of engineer hours, and sometimes you got to tell the customer, I understand this is a really important story, it's going to take us 2 iterations to do it. And sometimes you can say, by the end of the first iteration, we will have finished this much of the story, and we could show you a demo of that much just to make sure that we're on the right track. But understand that it's a certain amount of work, and we won't be able to finish the whole thing until 2 iterations. Okay? But that's, I think, one of the key things about Agile is you kind of just pointed it out. You sort of never trade quality for anything else. There's a process by which you do things in a disciplined way, and sometimes a non-negotiable side effect of that process is you cannot do as much as the customer would have liked. A classic trade-off that I hope you never make is you could say, well, we had to split the story into 2 pieces. If we didn't have to write tests for all that stuff, we could finish both pieces this week. But if we also have to make sure that we have good test coverage and the code is nice and clean and people have reviewed it, well, that's going to take longer, and then we can only finish one of the pieces this iteration. You will save yourself so much grief and pain if you make the hard choice now of getting what appears to be less work done, because it isn't really less work. If you deliver only half of the total story, but that half of the story has tests that you know are solid, the code has been reviewed by other team members, so there aren't silly bugs hiding in it, you're going to save so much time in the future by not having to go back and fix stuff that should have worked the first time. There's no worse feeling than having the customer say, I tried the thing you said, but when I tried it, it blew up, or it did the wrong thing. You're going to feel awful. You'll get over it, but it's bad. So the part of the Agile process is understanding that it's not just the bare minimum code to get something to work. It's let's do it right. Because otherwise, in the long run, you end up wasting time going back to fix stuff that was done sloppily. Probably every team is going to do that at least once, and my hope is that the lesson will be so bitter that you'll never do it again. But I won't lie to you. I used to do it the same way. This way of building software has absolutely changed my life, but I did not always do it this way. And now that I do it this way, I cannot imagine what I was thinking when I did it not this way. OK, I'll stop proselytizing. If your team is not even completing a story per iteration, something's wrong. It might be that your stories are still too large, or it might be that something about your team process is not functional, but it's worth investigating. If you're not delivering a story each iteration, and my hope is that most teams here will be delivering several stories per iteration. All right, onward to the letter R. Relevant. How do you know that the story has business value? Because presumably if the customer says, I want it to do this, they know their business and there's some reason they want to do that. Now, you don't want to second guess them and say, well, okay, prove that it has business value. But a gentle way that you can probe to see why this story, why are they prioritizing this story, is you could try asking the why 5 different times. So for this story about showing the patrons Facebook friends, if I'm the box office manager or whatever, and you're talking to me and saying, Mr. Box Office Manager, why is it so important that you have this feature where people can see who's their friends who are going to the show? I could say the reason I want that is I think people will buy more tickets if they can see who's going. And you say, oh, that makes sense. Not to be stupid, but why do you want people to buy more tickets? Well, if people buy more tickets, then the theater does better, and the theater will be able to put on better productions. And okay, and if the theater put on better productions, what would that mean? It's like, well, then we could attract even more people, and those paying customers actually could pay my salary because I need to get paid. And why do you need to get paid? Well, okay, at this point you're starting to hit bottom, right? Eventually they'll say something like, well, if I don't get paid, no one runs the theater, and then it goes out of business. So that's maybe a little bit extreme. You don't always have to get to 5, but if you can get through 5, then you're good, right? It's basically a way of forcing both of you not to sort of second guess the customer and saying, well, I don't know if you really know your business. It's about help us, the team, the technical team, help us understand your business, because the better we understand your business, the better position we'll be in. For example, if we can't do the whole story, we'll have more information about your business, and we can figure out maybe how to prioritize pieces of it that will give you part of the benefit or something. Okay? So this is a nice, simple way to sort of get to the bottom of business value, and it's one way to measure relevant. And the last was time-boxed. You got to know when to give up. If you've budgeted a certain amount of time for a story, you're coming up on the end of the iteration, you feel like you're just grinding against the wall, nothing's happening, give up and get help. Talk to your coach, talk to me, figure out why you were not successful in predicting whether you'd be able to finish that story. Is it that it was too big? Is it that it turns out that the story is blocked on other stories? Like it depends on other things in the app that aren't working yet, and maybe that's the reason. And at that point, whatever's left undone, that's going to be sort of refactored into new stories that probably will get pushed into the next iteration. You can't win them all. We're going to use a tool called Pivotal Tracker, which tracks not how many stories you've done, but basically a weighted sum of stories by how hard they are. We're going to talk about that next. But the general idea behind time boxing is you don't just sort of let it drag on forever being undone. If it's not done by the end of the iteration, that's a moment to ask why. And that's something that your team will do at a retro or a retrospective meeting, which you're going to do at the end of every iteration saying what went well and what didn't. And that's where things like this might come up.